The Mandalorians are one of the most awesome warrior cultures in the entire Star Wars galaxy. Their distinctive armor and their relentless fighting spirit make them firm favorites, even though they've often found themselves on the wrong side of galactic history. In this video, I'm going to take you through the entire timeline of the Mandalorians, from the Tong and ancient Star Wars lore to their role in the Sith Imperial War over 100 years after the Battle of Yavin. Before we start, I want to clarify that I'm going to focus primarily on the Legends timeline because it's much longer and richer than the new canon. However, there are still aspects from canon that I'll discuss, like the Darksaber and Din Djarin's sect, the Children of the Watch. At times, there are drastic differences between the two continuities, including the origins of the Mandalorians and the fate of the actual planet Mandalore itself. But don't worry, I'll be sure to make it obvious where the timelines diverge and differ. Time to strap on your jetpack because this one is going to be a long ride, spanning more than 25,000 years of galactic history, with a lot of war. Let's begin by discussing who the Mandalorians actually are. This may seem obvious on the surface because you're probably just thinking they're the tough guys in Beskar armor. In the modern Star Wars galaxy we see in the movies or on TV, it's more accurate to describe being a Mandalorian as a mindset and as part of an ancient culture. The new official canon says that they originated on Mandalore about 10,000 BBY, and we don't get much information about their ancient deeds beyond vaguely retconning some Legends storylines. However, if we go back to Legends, we learn that the history of the Mandalorians actually stretches back millennia before the Republic. According to the Essential Guide to Alien Species, the Mandalorians adopted the warlike culture of the ancient Tong species. These fearsome beings were native to Coruscant, which the same guide says was possibly also the original homeworld of humans, the galaxy's most influential species. Like humans, they were a simian people, but much more imposing. They stood at about 2 meters tall with gray skin and yellow eyes, weighing about 95 kilograms or 210 pounds. Galaxy at War explains that they reached adulthood when they were 13. Tong were notable for their aggression with powerful muscles, sharp claws, and an impressive ability to endure physical hardships. It's also worth noting that there are no known examples of any Force-sensitive Tong, which is extremely unusual because there was even a Hutt Jedi in Legends. The Tong and the 13 human clans of Coruscant entered a long, brutal, and bloody conflict. The human forces became known as the Battalions of Zhel and fiercely competed with the Tong for supremacy. I highly recommend checking out an article of Star Wars Insider 80 called The History of the Mandalorians, exploring the evolution of a mighty race of warriors, because it gives a great insight into this far ancient period. The intense war between the humans and the Tong was relatively even until a powerful volcanic eruption darkened the skies of Coruscant. The Zhel suffered catastrophic losses, but somehow turned the tide against the Tong and forced them off-world. During this period, the Tong referred to themselves as the Warriors of the Shadow in their language, which is a pretty awesome nickname. The defeated Tong fled to the planet Rune in the Outer Rim, where we know they stayed until about 7,000 BBY. There's not much to say about Rune during this period except that it was relatively close to the Twi'lek homeworld of Ryloth, but remained extremely isolated. The sourcebook Geonosis and the Outer Rim worlds explains that an asteroid ring surrounded the planet. However, more ominously, Rune lay within an impenetrable cosmic dust cloud known as the Cloak of the Sith. Anyway, it obviously suited the Tong to rebuild their numbers, but they didn't want to stay there forever because they were actively searching for a new long-term home. The next question is, why didn't they remain on Rune? The Essential Atlas emphasizes its isolation and that half of the planet lies constantly dark and cold. We're never given an outright reason, but I think it's fair to speculate that it just wasn't suitable for the Tong as an aggressively warrior culture. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that the Tong spent the next few centuries wandering the Outer Rim until they finally found their new homeworld in about 7,000 BBY. Led by a warlord they called Mandalore I, they named the planet after him. In their language, Mandalore translates to Sole Ruler, and subsequent leaders would also use the word as their highest title. The Essential Atlas describes how the planet Mandalore was a savage world in the Outer Rim, where the dominant life form was the gigantic non-sentient mythosaurs. The complete Star Wars encyclopedia says that these enormous lizards could reach the size of a small city and had huge downturned horns. Sadly, the Tong slaughtered the mythosaurs as they tested their skill with their swords and axes, until none of the great beasts remained alive. After conquering and taming their new world, the Tong renamed themselves the Mandalorians, and the mythosaur skull became an emblem of their culture. The Old Republic Codex explains how they used the calcified bones as construction materials for Mandalore's first cities, as well as powerful axes that the Mandalorian crusaders later carried in battle. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind. Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. However, the most important Mandalorian symbol in Legends was definitely Mandalore's mask. As the name suggests, this was a golden ceremonial mask carved from the sternum of a mythosaur. Tales of the Jedi tells us how it was passed down over thousands of years from the Tong warlord Mandalore I to the last known wearer, Canderous Ordo. The mythosaur lasted as an enduring symbol of the Mandalorians all the way to the Galactic Empire. The novel Imperial Commando 501st reveals how one entrepreneur even reconstructed a mythosaur skeleton in a failed bid to lure tourists to Mandalore. At this point, I want to go back and briefly explain the origins of the Mandalorians in canon. It will be very concise because this is basically where their timeline starts. The Tong don't exist in the retconned universe at all, which is a shame because they're awesome. Another major difference that we know from the Mandalorian TV series is that they didn't actively wipe out the mythosaurs, but actually rode them instead. Nonetheless, the mythosaurs did fall into near extinction anyway, and that's basically all we've got about the origins of the Mandalorians in canon, at least until the rise of the Neo-Crusaders. You can see now why I'm focusing on Legends for their ancient history. Before we continue, I want to give a bit more background about the planet Mandalore. It had a rich natural landscape with sprawling grasslands and vast Veshok tree farming, so it was very suitable for habitation. Although the Tong were hardly natural farmers, it was also only one of 2 known places in the galaxy, alongside its moon Concordia, that possessed a unique iron ore known as Beskar. This almost indestructible metal is so strong that it's even resistant to lightsabers, as we saw on screen in The Mandalorian and the Acolyte. Beskar became a crucial addition to Mandalorian culture as their smiths forged it into weapons and armor. However, it's interesting that the Tong wore less armor than the later Mandalorian culture that evolved after they faded away, because they saw unarmed combat as the highest honor. The Mandalorians also forged their iconic T-visors and slanted armor in the image of the Tong's distinctive bone structure. The novel Imperial Commando 501st even states, Mandalorians jealously guard their Beskar working skills and refuse to sell the formulas for any price. Attempts to reproduce finished Beskar elsewhere have been disappointing. The ore is found solely on Mandalore, and only Mandalorians know how to work it to maximize its extraordinary properties. This is no surprise because it gave them an instant advantage on the battlefield against most ordinary foes, and was an equalizer against powerful opponents like the Jedi. However, the Tong were never going to settle down and become pacifist farmers just because they found a new homeworld. Gradually, they developed the thirst to engage in battle with new foes and to wreak havoc across the galaxy. Their first major conflict was with the insectoid Nevuda species, who were led by a cunning warlord named Ithcharka. The Old Republic Codex explains how the Nevuda were one of the deadliest species in the galaxy before the old Sith Wars, and that they were utterly disdainful of death. This was probably just as well because the Mandalorians wiped them all out. During this period, the Mandalorians began to actively deify war and consider their invasions to be holy crusades. That's why they informally labeled themselves the Mandalorian Crusaders, proceeding to eliminate other species in their entirety, including the Fenalar, the Quarrens, and the Basiliskans. The Mandalorians were humble enough to adopt the technology of their victims after rendering them extinct, including Basilisk war droids and Fenalar-designed Kandosi-type dreadnoughts, but more on them later. I should note that technically they didn't wipe out the Basiliskans, but they fell into such a decline that they eventually lost sentience. Of course, most Mandalorians we encounter in canon and legends are humans. It's crucial to understand that while the Tong called themselves Mandalorians, they considered this a warrior culture rather than a species indicator. They allowed other beings to become Mandalorians, with the first being the Mandalorian giants, who hailed from the neighboring planet of Mandalia. Star Wars Insider 80 explains how these heavily muscled, tall reptilian humanoids successfully repelled the Mandalorian invaders. Like the Tong, they trained in various forms of unarmed combat from infancy. They impressed the Mandalorian Crusaders, earning their respect and becoming the first non-Tong to be accepted into their culture, but by no means the last. That's also why, according to the principles established in the Legends continuity, it's totally legitimate for Grogu to become Mandalorian. But don't take my word for it. In the novel Imperial Commando 501st, Rana Tanast, aka Mandalore the Destroyer, says it best. She tells the Consul of Luon, "We're not huddled in one place. We span the galaxy. We need no lords or leaders, so you can't destroy our command. We can live without technology, so we can fight with our bare hands. We have no species or bloodline, so we can rebuild our ranks with others who want to join us. We're more than just a people or an army. We're a culture. We're an idea. And you can't kill ideas, but we can certainly kill you." At this point, we should note that the Mandalorians were still a nomadic people. Except for their homeworld Mandalore, they didn't permanently occupy the planets they conquered, instead moving on after the ruthless victories. However, if there was one mistake that the Mandalorians have repeated over and over to their detriment, it's allying themselves with the Sith. This occurred for the first time as the Mandalorian Crusaders began moving towards the deep core. First, they took the rocky world of Quar and wiped out most of the natives. The complete Star Wars Encyclopedia explains how they plan to use Quar's abandoned underground cities as staging posts for the invasion of the Empress Teta system. Around this time, the Empress Teta system was extremely wealthy as one of the few places in the galaxy where carbonite was available for extraction. The Tales of the Jedi comic book series shows how Senegar, the capital of the planet Empress Teta, fell under the control of a dark side cult known as the Krath. They clashed with the Republic before attracting the attention of the Mandalorians, who were always up for a fight with anybody, at any time, and anywhere. Unfortunately, this would cost them, and especially the Tong, dearly. At this point, the Mandalorian leader was Mandalore the Indomitable. He justifiably believed that the Empress Teta system was in chaos, so this was the perfect time to sweep in and unleash carnage. One of their most effective weapons at this point was the Basilisk war droids that I've already mentioned. They pillaged these semi-sentient droids from Basilisk during their earlier crusades and adapted them to suit different combat roles. In the Old Republic expansion Legacy of the Sith, the Mandalorian Lane Vizsla explained how the warriors formed close bonds with their droids. Vizsla said, "Basilisk war droids are like nothing else. We can ride them, form bonds with them. They're like beasts, but better. They can carry mines, cannons, missile launchers, plasma generators. They're dangerously beautiful." There were even examples of Basilisk droids howling in anguish when their Mandalorian riders died. Basilisk had thick armor and 6 legs of various sizes. Typically, they reach between 3 and 5 meters, depending on the model. Modified Basilisks had enclosed cockpits, although many Mandalorians simply controlled their droids from armored saddles. The Essential Guide to Droids reveals that they had a lethal and expansive loadout that varied depending on the rider. Inbuilt weapons could include pulse cannons, missile systems, laser cannons, and their devastating shockwave generator rods that could rip through starship hulls. Basilisks were multi-purpose and could operate on land, in the air, or even in space. It was common for Mandalorians to use them to dive bomb targets on planets below or to latch onto enemy starships. Although they were slow and used as walkers, their powerful armor made them a fearsome foe, and they could literally rip opponents apart with their claws. Mandalore the Indomitable and his forces attracted unexpected attention when their Basilisk war droids destroyed a strategically significant Titan carbonite smelter. They took the Sith Lord Ulic Qel-Droma and his forces completely by surprise in what would be a major turning point for the Mandalorians. Before we continue, I want to do a sidebar on Qel-Droma because it will give important context. Qel-Droma is up there with Anakin Skywalker and Jacen Solo as one of the most tragic figures in galactic history. He was a notable Jedi Knight who played a defining role in the Beast Wars of Andorian, fighting against the dark side of the Force and the ghost of the ancient Sith Lord Freedon Nad. This all takes place in the Tales of the Jedi series, and I highly recommend checking it out. Everything changed when the Krath declared war against the Jedi Order, with Qel-Droma suffering grievous wounds as he fought against them in a space battle at Koros Major. After the defeat at Koros Major, a massive Jedi convocation took place at Mount Meru on the planet Deniba in the Mid-Rim. Most of the Jedi were in favor of facing the Krath in a massive head-to-head confrontation, but Qel-Droma had another suggestion. He believed that war with the Krath would cost countless lives, so he proposed that he go undercover and learn their secrets before destroying them from within. The senior Jedi, including his former master Arca Jeth, reacted with horror and told him that the dark side would consume him regardless of his noble intentions. Mere moments later, Jeth would die in a Krath droid ambush that the Jedi ultimately repelled. Long story short, Qel-Droma went to Empress Teta, and after they tortured him, he embedded himself in the Krath. Eventually, he earned the trust of Alima Cato, one of their two leaders, and even embarked on an affair with her. However, he was given the ultimate test of loyalty when his true love, the Jedi Nomi Sunrider, came to rescue him, but the Krath captured her. He reluctantly agreed, although she fortunately escaped before they forced him to carry out the act. The defining moment came with the arrival of another former Jedi, Exar Kun. They dueled, but Kun easily defeated Qel-Droma. However, the pair were wearing Sith amulets that combined to release the Force ghost of the ancient Sith Lord, Marka Ragnos. The amulet had already corrupted Qel-Droma's spirit, but nobody could have predicted the dark road he was about to embark on. Ragnos ordered them to stop fighting and proclaimed their initiation to the Sith complete. Exar Kun was the new Dark Lord of the Sith, while Qel-Droma was his apprentice. And so began the Great Sith War as they began their efforts to destroy the Republic and conquer the galaxy. I've obviously powered through this faster than the Boonta Eve pod race, but I want to get back to the Mandalorians. The Sith developed superweapons, including the Force Harvester, which could drain the Force from every living organism nearby. This was at the center of an even bigger weapon, the Dark Reaper, which, according to the Complete Encyclopedia, fired massive bolts of Force lightning. However, the Sith forces had one major issue. They didn't have a big enough army to conquer the Republic, and that's where the Mandalorians came in. Going back to Mandalore the Indomitable's early statement victories in the Empress Teta system, he attracted Qel-Droma's attention and impressed the Sith Lord. Qel-Droma took a massive risk by reaching out to the Warlord and ordering him to surrender, but Mandalore challenged him to single combat. The Sith Lord accepted this challenge, and even allowed his Mandalorian opponent to set the terms. As we see in the very first Tales of the Jedi comic, they fought on the desert plains of Harkul, with Mandalore enjoying multiple advantages. He didn't allow Qel-Droma a mount and used his Basilisk droid against the Sith Lord. After several twists and turns, Qel-Droma finally wounded Mandalore and had him at his mercy. The Mandalorian warlord congratulated Qel-Droma and instructed him to take his life as was his right, but the Sith Lord had other ideas. He ordered Mandalore to pledge allegiance to him and his master Exar Kun, as the Sith and the Mandalorians fought together for the first time. It wouldn't be the last, but it's probably not much of a spoiler to say that these arrangements almost always end in tears for the Mandalorians. Also, it's worth noting that the Mandalorians did serve Ulic Qel-Droma in the canon timeline, but there isn't much expansion about these events yet. However, it did start relatively well for both parties as they united with the Krath and assaulted the Republic shipyards at Forest, capturing 300 starships in the process. Their next move was the invasion of Coruscant itself, with the Mandalorians attacking from their fearsome Basilisk droids. But then an unexpected event occurred as Alima Cato betrayed Ulic Qel-Droma and abandoned the Sith Lord at the mercy of the Jedi. Initially, Mandalore the Indomitable pledged loyalty to her, but he discovered the reality of her betrayal and it disgusted him. Mandalore and Exar Kun stormed the Senate building and rescued Keldroma, who later slew Kato in revenge. After this, the Mandalorians had the task of capturing the Izzy's royal palace on Onderon. However, this was an extremely volatile environment, and the Mandalorians met their match against the planet's beast riders and their impressive Drexel mounts. A Republic fleet came to Onderon's aid, so the Mandalorians attempted a tactical withdrawal. Disaster struck when enemy fire shot down Mandalore the Indomitable's Basilisk droid, and he crash-landed in the jungles below. Onderon's wild beast attacked him, and he succumbed to his wounds. The Mandalorians searched for the ruler, and finally, One-Tong discovered his body and the Mask of Mandalore. The new essential chronology reveals that he claimed it by the rights of his people and became the new Mandalore in 3996 BBY. He would become known as Mandalore the Ultimate and change their culture forever. The Great Sith Wars eventually ended in the defeat for Kun, Keldroma, and their allies. It also resulted in the irrevocable decline of the Tong, a fact that Mandalore the Ultimate accepted. He proactively invited other cultures to join the Mandalorians, aggressively recruiting members from many different species. Cassius Fett, a human Mandalorian field marshal and ancestor of Jango and Boba, advocated for more specialized armor to suit the physiology of different beings. This also gave them a more uniform appearance that unified each Mandalorian regardless of their species or background. The new essential chronology explains that Fett helped to streamline the Mandalorians into a much more efficient and coordinated force as they moved further from the Tong philosophy of combat. The galaxy then entered a period of history known as the Restoration, which lasted almost 3 decades. This was when the Republic explored new hyperspace lanes and rebuilt its forces. However, the Mandalorians also licked their wounds and plotted revenge against their enemies. Mandalore the Ultimate and Fett established clandestine outposts, including Unity Base beneath the planetary crust of Kalite. Originally, the Mandalorians intended it to be a forward supply post, but it became more of an academy for new members of the Mandalorian culture. The radicalized Mandalorians increasingly believed that their destiny was at hand, a final battle that would seal their fate in a near-apocalyptic vision. The galaxy enjoyed a period of relative peace for almost 30 years before the next major conflict kicked off. It's no surprise that the Mandalorians were the perpetrators because they were itching for vengeance. However, little did they know that in the unknown regions, another Sith Emperor was planning the destruction of the galaxy and all life within it. This was Vitiate, who would become Valkorion, arguably the most powerful Sith in history except Darth Sidious. Honestly, he made Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma look like Comic-Con cosplayers. We know from the Old Republic game that he was scheming and plotting from the secret Sith world of Dromund Kaas. He saw an opportunity to manipulate the Mandalorians into causing chaos and disrupting the Republic. The Sith Emperor sent an envoy to Mandalore the Ultimate and influenced him using his dark side powers. Mandalore fell into the trap, and his forces began conquering their sector in a period of rapid expansion. One of the most notable results was that the Mandalorians retained and consolidated their new territory into an empire of their own. Previously, they moved on rapidly after defeating their unfortunate enemy, but now they started to build up their forces like never before. This was the dawn of the Neo-Crusader movement, and they quickly built a territory that was larger than Hutt space in about a decade. The Mandalorians were never the most merciful invaders and had a history of wiping out entire worlds. They continued this trend when Cathar Fett led a force of Neo-Crusaders against the Cathar and eliminated about 90% of the species. Crucially, the Republic refused to intervene because it was wary of being drawn into another long and bloody conflict so soon after the Great Sith War. The Jedi were also deeply divided after internal reforms, with the Council refusing to permit action against the Mandalorians. This angered many of their knights, who believed they were betraying their principles through inaction. Finally, after a brief lull that lured the Republic into a false sense of security, the Mandalorians broke out and attacked the Republic properly, taking Onderon, Dixon, and Taris in quick succession. Then they committed horrific war crimes by nuclear bombing civilian population centers on the planet Sirocco. If the Sith Emperor wanted chaos, he was getting it in spades. Mandalorians did face some adversity, including the horrific Rakghoul Plague on Jebel. Cassius Fett commanded his forces to nuclear bomb it because it seemed like the simplest solution. Players of Knights of the Old Republic will be very familiar with the awful Rakghoul disease, which infected some Neo-Crusaders and was present in the Undercity on Taris. Despite this, the Mandalorians appeared to be sweeping into a ruthless and dominant victory. But then a force emerged from within the Jedi Order, a sect of knights known as the Revanchists. Led by the Jedi Revan and Malak, they revived the Republic's forces and pushed the Mandalorians back in a series of unlikely and inspiring victories. Revan was a tactical genius and a spectacular warrior. They defeated the Mandalorians at Taris and Dixon before meeting them in the decisive battle above Malachor V, a planet with a long Sith history. The new Essential Chronology reveals that Revan drew on Malachor V's dark side energy to defeat Mandalore the Ultimate in one-on-one combat before one of the Jedi generals activated the Mass Shadow Generator. This was an experimental superweapon that wasn't very Jedi in nature, and could create a gravity anomaly strong enough to destroy any planet. It wiped out most of the Mandalorian fleet and some of the Republic's forces in a catastrophic result for the warrior culture. Before he died, Mandalore the Ultimate admitted the existence of a secret Sith Emperor who tricked the Mandalorians into doing his dirty work. We know from Knights of the Republic 2 that the Mandalorians unconditionally surrendered. Revan then forced them to give up their armor and weapons, including their famous Basilisk droids, in a humiliating blow for their people. They were able to reclaim or replace their Beskar armor for the most part, but Basilisks became increasingly rare across the galaxy. Revan's most devastating action against the Mandalorians was the confiscation of the Mask of Mandalore. This broke the lineage of supreme leaders, and they fell into a disjointed period known as the Clan Era. Meanwhile, Revan and Malak vanished into the unknown regions in search of the mysterious Sith Emperor who pulled the Mandalorian strings. The Mandalorians entered a period of uncertainty with no Mandalore leading them, and the Tong were driven to near extinction. Knights of the Old Republic reveals how the Mandalorians became increasingly disjointed and their people scattered throughout the Outer Rim. Many of them sought service as mercenaries or as bounty hunters, and a new tradition that many beings across the galaxy would associate them with over the ensuing millennia. There were even examples of Mandalorians fighting as gladiators, or in some cases, as pirates in the Outer Rim. Soon, the galaxy found itself in the midst of another major conflict. The now Darth Revan returned from the unknown regions with his apprentice, Darth Malak, in 3959 BBY. This came after the powerful Sith Emperor Vitiate corrupted them with his dark side powers, overwhelming their minds and transforming them into Sith Lords. However, we know from the Revan novel that the new recruits showed more resistance than Vitiate expected and escaped back to the main galaxy, where they forged their own empire. This period became known as the Jedi Civil War and almost brought the Republic down. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because the Mandalorians didn't have a significant role in the conflict. Some units did attack Sith forces on Taris and other planets and targeted strikes out of pure vengeance. We know from Knights of the Old Republic that the Jedi eventually captured Revan and wiped his memory, turning the tide. The now redeemed Revan sought to defeat his former apprentice, Darth Malak, who was seeking the Starforge, an ancient relic of the Rakatan Empire that could produce endless military resources. Along his travels, he met Canderous Ordo, a former Mandalorian Neo-Crusader who now served as a mercenary. They also encountered and fought Mandalorian warriors on Dantooine, Kashyyyk, and Lahan on their adventures. Ordo is a key figure because he fought at Revan's side throughout the journey and even received honors from the Republic for helping to destroy the Starforge. Most notably, Revan recounted his lost memories, including the atrocities he committed as a Sith Lord. But he also remembered that he had previously gone to the unknown regions and that something changed him there. We know from the Revan novel that before he began a new journey to confront this mysterious threat, he worked with Clan Ordo to find the Mask of Mandalore that he confiscated after defeating the Neo-Crusaders. They located it on Rekiad, and Ordo took the title Mandalore the Preserver. Ordo began a campaign to reunite the Mandalorian clans and strengthen his authority when he encountered a dying Tong who claimed to be the true Mandalore. The Old Republic reveals that Mandalore the Ultimate was a usurper. Ordo received the Tong's armor as a gift and incorporated the Mask of Mandalore into it, removing it so rarely that very few knew his true identity. Countless clans joined him at the former Neo-Crusader base on Dixon, although the new Mandalore had to vanquish some who challenged his claim. Mandalore the Preserver allied with the exiled Jedi, Mira Surik, against the Sith triumvirate of Darth Nihilus, Darth Traya, and Darth Sion. This time, the Mandalorians were on the right side of history as they helped liberate Andorian, reclaiming Freda Nad's tomb from the Sith, as we see in Knights of the Old Republic 2. They also engaged the Sith fleet alongside the Republic at the crucial Battle of Telos 4. Finally, Ordo played a crucial role in helping Surik defeat Darth Traya on Malachor 4, the site of the Mandalorians' worst defeat. Before her death at the hands of Surik, Traya correctly foresaw that Ordo would one day fall in battle. Despite Mandalore the Preserver's best efforts, his people remained fragmented for the next 3 centuries. Everything changed when the true Sith Empire returned under Vitiate, whom most knew simply as the Emperor. The Old Republic Revan novel explains that Vitiate began life as Tenebrae, a pure-blood Sith on the isolated world of Nathema. His various misdeeds before the age of 10, including trapping his father's spirit in a holocron, where it would remain for almost 2 millennia, and draining the essence of all life on his planet. His ultimate goal as Sith Emperor was to repeat the ritual he performed on Nathema on a much larger scale, absorbing all living energy from across the entire galaxy. You might wonder why he'd want to do such a thing, because then there'd be nothing left for him to rule, right? Actually, we know from the Old Republic MMO that Vitiate had thought about this. It didn't bother him if the galaxy was empty because he could basically master his hobbies before moving on to other galaxies and repeating the same process as per his fancy. To say he was a terrifying individual is putting it lightly. However, despite his capacity for unbelievable acts of devastation, he was extremely pragmatic. Vitiate didn't involve himself in the ancient Great Hyperspace War when Naga Sadow invaded the Republic. He sat back hundreds of years later when Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma tried to create a new Sith Empire. Then he tricked the Mandalorians into invading the Republic in a proxy conflict under Mandalore the Ultimate. Finally, he made his move in 3661 BBY. The Sith performed horrific atrocities as they invaded the Republic in the Great Galactic War, but they actively tried to recruit Mandalorian mercenaries to assist them. However, the Mandalorians had long memories and knew that their previous experiences of working alongside the Sith didn't work out too well. The Galactic Timelines video series explains how the Sith didn't take no for an answer. Their intelligence chose an impressive Mandalorian gladiator on Geonosis and handpicked him as the new Mandalore, manipulating the crowd into a frenzy of support as they handpicked opponents for him to defeat. The Old Republic tells us that many Mandalorians flocked to his banner as per their culture's tenets, and even joined the fight against the Jedi. However, it's crucial to understand that not all of them did, and they remained a divided people who interpreted the Mandalorian canons of honor in different ways. The ancient canons of honor don't actually exist in modern Star Wars canon. Instead, their warriors follow the Mandalorian Code, which we don't have much detail on. In Star Wars Rebels, Sabine Wren invokes the Code to challenge Fenn Rau to a duel above Conquered Dawn, but there's not much more than this. Anyway, going back to our main narrative, many Mandalorians correctly identified their new leader as a Sith figurehead and even gave him the nickname Mandalore the Lesser. Ouch. Mandalore the Lesser tried to consolidate his authority by issuing a galactic-wide challenge to his people called the Great Hunt. The winner of this quest for glory was Artus Locke, whose next move was to challenge Mandalore the Lesser to a duel. He slew the false leader and proclaimed himself Mandalore the Vindicated. The new Mandalore ordered his diaspora to join with the Sith against the Republic, but one faction under Jeken Cardera believed they should follow the example of Mandalore the Preserver, who fought alongside the Jedi. You know, the guys who didn't betray the Mandalorians or manipulate them in every single coalition? Right. Anyway, Mandalore the Vindicated suppressed this resistance movement known as the Crusader Schism, but this didn't stop some Mandalorian clans from fighting against the Sith. After 28 years of conflict, the Great Galactic War reached an official bloody end after the Republic's shocking defeat on Coruscant. It was a victory for the Sith, but the Old Republic showed how the Mandalorians suffered very heavy losses. The Jedi Master Kellyan Jarro slew over 100 Mandalorian troopers and became an instant figure of infamy, as well as reluctant admiration. The Republic and the Sith Empire signed the Treaty of Coruscant in 3653 BBY, which led to a glorified ceasefire and a period known as the Cold War. Dozens of proxy conflicts broke out during this period as the Republic and Sith rebuilt their forces, with Mandalorian forces often at the center of them. The Old Republic Codex reveals that Mandalorians remained in service to the Sith when full-scale galactic war broke out in 3642 BBY. One of their most notable engagements was at the Battle of Corellia, where their rocket troops gave them an advantage against the Republic forces, although the Jedi ultimately drove them away. A Mandalorian bounty hunter also assassinated the Republic's Supreme Chancellor in another momentous event. However, if we fast forward through the remainder of the war, the Sith lost. Mandalore the Vindicated found himself under the command of Darth Malgus, who tried to start another Sith empire, but that flamed out pretty quickly. Later, Clan Vizsla found itself involved in the Revanite crisis, fighting alongside the Nova Blades. We know from the Old Republic game that Shae Vizsla, who became Mandalore the Avenger and the first female to hold the title, later fought in the final battle against Revan and his radical sect. By the way, don't mistake this Clan Vizsla with the other similarly named clan that also had a lot of influence on Mandalorian society in both legends and canon continuities. The next major galactic war began when the princes Thexan and Arcan led the Eternal Empire in a surprise attack against the Republic and Sith worlds. They were the sons of Valkorion, the last reincarnation of the Sith Emperor Vitiate. The Mandalorians fought against the Eternal Empire forces but found themselves on the defensive, with Mandalore the Vindicated losing his life. Even though he supported fighting with the Sith against the Republic, he was a valiant and noble warrior with a code of honor, so this was a major blow to their cause. In the Knights of the Fallen expansion pack, Skytrooper droids overwhelm him, inflaming the Mandalorians' hatred of battle droids. Shae Vizsla became their new leader and, despite her lack of experience, proved to be exactly who they needed. Eventually, Mandalore joined the Eternal Alliance with her people, fighting alongside the Republic and the Sith against Valkorion's massive forces. Then, Mandalore the Avenger and her forces assisted the Republic in the Third Galactic War, this time against the resurgent Sith Empire. Their key contribution was during the Battle of the Meridian Complex, as the Avenger distinguished herself in combat. Her next problem was the small matter of a bloody Mandalorian civil war that she faced during the Third Galactic War. This saw Heta Kull, a Mandalorian field marshal, found a group of disenfranchised clans known as the Hidden Chain. In the Old Republic MMO, she outlined her devotion to the Mandalorian legacy of fighting for honor and the glory of distinguishing oneself on the battlefield. She viciously criticized Mandalore the Avenger, stating she has driven out those who oppose her view, yet she has remade the Mandalorians into servants of anyone who pays her enough credits, no matter what they believe. Where's the honor in that? Kull had a point, because the Mandalorians weren't the people they once were, but this wasn't entirely Shae Vizsla's fault. After all, the Mandalorians were a divided people before she became Mandalore, and credits were a great unifier. Ultimately, Vizsla brought the Mandalorian Civil War to an end by releasing her prisoner Darth Malgus from custody and allying with him. Vizsla also resisted the desire of her advisor, Jango Fett, who basically wanted to revive the Neo-Crusaders because she recognized how vulnerable the Mandalorians really were. At this point, you will probably have really started to appreciate why this franchise is called Star Wars. This was one of the bloodiest eras in galactic history, with one major conflict after another leaving trillions dead, species eradicated, and entire planets destroyed. There was one more major war which involved the Mandalorians and had a profound impact on their culture for 2 millennia. Known as the New Sith Wars in Legends, or the Jedi-Sith War in canon, this was the conflict that almost destroyed the Republic and the Sith. Ultimately, we know from the Darth Bane novel that he was basically the last Sith standing after 1,000 years of conflict before he went into hiding and created the Rule of Two. But this video is about the Mandalorians, not the Sith. The Mandalorians broke the habit of a lifetime by attacking the Sith after the Jedi Master Murtagh bought their services. They rode Lagaroth's war dragons in the conflict, which were basically the devolved Basiliscan people. The Mandalorians continued their involvement in the war despite discovering that they've been manipulated into combat against the Sith. However, according to Star Wars Adventure Journal 5, by 1060 BBY, their society had suffered a catastrophic societal change. This was because of the horrific Andorian plague that decimated planets across the galaxy, with Mandalore itself also falling victim. Also known as the Blue Shadow Virus, this airborne disease was especially deadly to humans who made up the overwhelming majority of Mandalorians by this point. If the virus sounds familiar, that's because it reappears throughout the Star Wars timeline in canon and legends. In the Clone Wars series, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme foil a separatist plot to unleash the Blue Shadow virus. Meanwhile, the new Essential Guide to Characters, a popular Legends guide, explains that General Krix Madine defected to the Republic after Imperial Storm Commandos released the virus on the planet Dental, killing 10 billion in 2 days. The Blue Shadow virus caused necrosis, respiratory distress, severe fatigue, and painful but mercifully quick death. Anyway, the plague decimated the Mandalorian population, and their ships even became vulnerable to pirate raiders, a reality which would have been impossible in previous eras. In 1058 BBY, a mercenary warrior, Aga Awad, returned to Mandalore and discovered the results of the Andorian plague, which wiped out most of his clan. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that 7 years later, he claimed the title Mandalore the Uniter and initiated the return. This was a movement to recall Mandalorians to their home world and to defend their sector from external influences, including the threat of pirates. Mandalore the Uniter and his successors stabilized his shattered people, laying the foundations for a thriving culture. Mandalorian space became powerful again and even offered protection services to nearby star systems. Meanwhile, Mandalore the Uniter restarted mass production of Mandalorian armor and created a new shock trooper corps that was more mobile than the Neo-Crusaders of the past. Now the Mandalorians wore lighter armor that made their jetpacks, a popular anti-Jedi weapon, even more effective. It's crucial to remember that none of this occurred in the canon timeline. Actually, around this period, Tar Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, created the Darksaber. Let's do a sidebar on the ancient history of this iconic weapon because it's fascinating. In the Mandalorian TV series, the armorer explains to Din Djarin that Vizsla built the saber over 1,000 years ago, in 1050 BBY. The Darksaber had a unique black blade with a flat and tapered shape that made it instantly stand out on the battlefield. Vizsla would later become the ruler of his people, and the Darksaber became the most iconic symbol of Mandalore. It essentially held the same value as Mandalore's mask in Legends, as the one who bore it was indisputable. The only way to claim it was to challenge the Darksaber's bearer and defeat them in combat. Originally, the Darksaber didn't exist in this form in the Legends continuity, although a super weapon did exist with the same name. In Kevin J. Anderson's novel Darksaber, Durga the Hutt oversees the construction of a miniaturized Death Star with the central super laser encased in a cylindrical Durasteel shell. The designer, Bevel Lemelisk, believed that it resembled a lightsaber, so he called it the Darksaber. However, just to make things a bit more complicated, the Clone Wars series is also considered a part of the Legends timeline. The Mandalorian Darksaber is officially part of Legends continuity too, albeit with a different origin story. In the Legends version, the Darksaber is a Jedi weapon of unknown creation. The Bounty Hunter Code from the Files of Boba Fett is a Legends source that provides some fascinating exposition. It describes it as a symbol of Mandalorian authority, liberated from the Jedi. In 2012, Dave Filoni even told IGN that the Darksaber was a more ancient version of a lightsaber, and that Pre-Vizsla's ancestors stole it from the Jedi. Obviously, this perspective is no longer canon, as they retconned it in Star Wars Rebels and The Mandalorian. Which origin story do you prefer? Let's get back on track with the next momentous event in Mandalorian history, which they came to call the Annihilation. If you're thinking they opened up the old Tong playbook and attacked some unfortunate planet, you're mistaken. This time they were the victims, as the Galactic Republic targeted their Mandalorian space. As I already mentioned, the Mandalorians re-emerged as a powerful force thanks to Mandalore the Uniter and his immediate successors. Suddenly, they were a major industrial player and a military power once again. The Republic was also rebuilding its strength after the costly new Sith Wars and brought the Outer Rim back into the fold. However, the Essential Guide to Warfare explains that this created tension with the Mandalorians, who had begun to tax commerce along the Hydean Way and were basically bullying their neighbors into becoming client states. That's why the Republic and the Jedi identified the Mandalorians as a clear threat despite previously allying with them against the Sith. To be fair, they had a long, bloody history of enmity, so you can see where the Republic was coming from. The Mandalorians disregarded the Republic's new defense force restrictions, although some division did emerge amongst their clans. Pro-peace leaders actually wanted to join the Republic because they didn't think they could beat it in a head-to-head war. However, it was conceivable that they could develop massive influence from within because of their regional power. However, the majority of Mandalorians desired to remain independent because they believed that if you weren't a warrior, you couldn't call yourself Mandalorian. This tension lingered for several centuries until the Jedi Order decided that the best way to maintain peace in the galaxy was to launch a preemptive strike against the Mandalorians. In 738 BBY, that's exactly what they did with the Republic, creating a special strike force to deal with the threat. The Essential Atlas explains how the Jedi led the Republic's judicial forces, as well as various planetary security forces, into Mandalorian space, intending to decapitate their key worlds. They devastated the likes of Mandalore, Fennel, Ordo, and conquered Dawn in a short and brutal war. The Essential Guide to Warfare reveals how parts of Mandalore remained desolate and uninhabitable during the modern Imperial era. The Mandalorian excision had a brutal impact on Mandalore and its other key worlds. Lethal bombardments created barren white deserts, wiping out fertile farmlands and forests as well as civilian habitations. They had no chance against the combined might of the Republic, and I think it's one of the most contentious deeds in Jedi history, even if it doesn't get that much notoriety. Unsurprisingly, the excision had a profound effect on Mandalorian culture. First, the Republic installed a caretaker government for the sector to pick up the pieces from the damaged society. These events proved to be extremely divisive amongst Mandalorians. Firstly, the name of the excision infuriated many of them. In the Bounty Hunter Code, Tor Vizsla says, "The Republic called this dishonorable assault the Mandalorian excision, as if we were cancerous tissue to be cut out of the galaxy. We call it the Dralhan, the Annihilation." These events exist in canon with slight deviations. Firstly, it's only known as the Annihilation in the canon version, not the excision. And secondly, there's far less exposition. In one emotional moment of Star Wars Rebels, Sabine Wren looks upon Mandalore's wastelands and says, "Once upon a time, these plains were covered with grass, but I never saw it. This destruction happened before I was born." A major schism erupted amongst the Mandalorians, with some advocating to embrace pacifism to ensure their survival, while others desired to follow the traditional warrior codes. These new Mandalorians built huge biocube cities and took Sundari as their capital on Mandalore. They disregarded the old tenets and put aside their warrior armor as they looked to build a new society from the wastelands of their world. It won't shock anybody to learn that not all Mandalorians were on board with giving up about 24,000 years of tradition after losing one short conflict. The Essential Atlas reveals that these diehards call the new Mandalorians the Faithless. The new Mandalorians directly contradicted the Raison d'Être, or Six Actions, which were the central tenets of Mandalorian life. Star Wars Insider 86 explains that these 6 tenets consisted of wearing armor, speaking the Mandalorian language, defending one's family, raising one's children as Mandalorians, contributing to the clan's welfare, and, when called upon by the Mandalore, rallying to their cause. It's almost impossible to imagine a Mandalorian without their armor, but the new Mandalorians rebuilt their society this way. Civilians adapted regular garments like pants, shirts, and dresses, as we see in the Clone Wars and later series. Blue and white were some of the most popular colors. Their security forces did don protective equipment for practical reasons, but it had a drastically different aesthetic from the traditional Mandalorian armor of eras past. For example, the Mandalorian Royal Guard wore an elaborate ceremonial helmet in a deliberate rejection of Mandalore's violent history. Despite this, Mandalorians still retained their knowledge of how to work Beskar, and they incorporated it into the structures of buildings in their cities. They were an inherently disciplined society, favoring order over the chaotic vibrancy of the past. What happened to the Mandalorians who didn't want to participate in this pacifist society? Well, a good number of them went into exile on Concordia, Mandalore's moon. Some followed the footsteps of their ancestors and became bounty hunters or mercenaries, but others sought to bring down the new Mandalorians with resistance movements arising from the planet's ashes. These included the true Mandalorians and the Death Watch, who would even fight amongst themselves. Mandalore didn't need more war, but unfortunately, that's exactly what would happen on this tragic and once beautiful world. Some people just don't want nice things. In the year 60 BBY, wow, we've come a long way, Mandalore was a divided planet with 2 governments. The biggest and most united faction was the new Mandalorians in major cities like Sundari and on Mandalore's neighboring world, Kalevala. However, many traditional clans follow the old ways, basing themselves in Mandalore's unspoilt countryside, the old capital of Keldab, or on Concordia. These Mandalorians called themselves the Akait, or Faithful, and their symbolic leaders still retain the title of Mandalore. As a Star Wars fan, it's easy to dismiss the new Mandalorians as soft or as traitors to their race. This is totally subjective, but even from an aesthetic level, they're just not as cool as the traditional Beskar armor-wearing Mandalorian. However, their leaders were trying to build a functional and prosperous society and didn't believe that randomly invading their neighbors was the best way to do this. As recently as 200 BBY, the Mandalorians had waged war against the Itholan for no good reason, committing genocide against the planet's unfortunate inhabitants. This was part of the tradition that some conservative Mandalorians wanted to maintain. A reformist movement emerged amongst a group of traditional supercommandos who were loyal to the reigning Mandalore, Jaster Muriel. These fighters called themselves the True Mandalorians. A fascinating figure, Muriel was a great warrior who once saved the life of a young Jango Fett, who would become his surrogate son. The history of the Mandalorians reveals that Muriel believed that his people should hold themselves to a higher standard. He empathetically embraced their warrior culture and disagreed profoundly with the new Mandalorians, but he also had contempt for the savagery and blatant war crimes that many Mandalorian commandos committed. With this in mind, he created the Super Commando Codex, a new moral guide based on his own ethics. These were essentially a modernized version of the old canons of honor that the ancient Mandalorian Crusaders and Neo-Crusaders followed. Galaxy at War explains that one of the key additions was that any Mandalorians who wished to fight should do so as highly paid soldiers or mercenaries, not as pirates or brigands. You might think that this brought him into conflict with the new Mandalorians, and perhaps it would have eventually, but no, his biggest enemy was a rival group of Faithful led by Tor Vizsla. Vizsla became the leader of a group of radical conservative Mandalorians who embraced bloody violence and amoral chaos. Known as the Death Watch, their leader wished to ignite another Mandalorian war and conquer the galaxy. He wished to continue their aggressive ways, and this took him into direct conflict with the noble and pragmatic Jaster Muriel. The Death Watch and the true Mandalorians fought in a short but bloody civil war that didn't help either side achieve their aspirations. In 58 BBY, Vizsla and his men had the new Mandalorians on the back foot. We know from Imperial Commando 501st that they hunted Muriel across Conquered Dawn, and this brought Vizsla into contact with the Fett clan. Vizsla violently interrogated Jango's father, a respected local journeyman protector. They held Jango at gunpoint when the elder Fett refused to break and threatened to kill him. However, then Jango's mother emerged and she heroically shot down the Death Watch trooper holding her son. Jango's father urged him to flee, and he ran for the fields before Muriel and his men saved him. He could hear gunfire in the distance behind him as Vizsla's forces executed his parents. The Death Watch burnt the fields before enjoying 2 days of drunken recreation in a nearby town. Muriel and his true Mandalorians took advantage of this opportunity by ambushing Vizsla and his men. During the battle, Vizsla took cover inside a tank, but a vengeful Jango placed a thermal detonator on the underside. The explosion left a flaming pile of debris, and Vizsla was presumed dead. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. Vizsla re-emerged like a cockroach in 52 BBY with a heavily scarred face from the burns he suffered in the explosion. He lured the true Mandalorians into an ambush on Corta 6. According to the comic book series Jango Fett Open Seasons, the Death Watch allied with the local Cordons, a primitive simian people. Before the Mandalorians' arrival, they wore chainmail armor and helmets with no advanced weaponry. Vizsla changed that by giving them blasters and showing them how to operate anti-aircraft cannons. The Death Watch trained a local security team called the Corda Defense Force and planted false information. Then they forced the Cordon allies to attack the KDF training squad, knowing this would compel them to call the true Mandalorians for backup. That's exactly what happened, and the true Mandalorians fell into the trap. 3 teams of new Mandalorians landed on the planet, led by Muriel, Jango Fett, and Muriel's trusted lieutenant, Montross. Muriel commanded the Headhunter Company, whose task was to retrieve the security team. Montross led Vertigo Squad, a unit of experienced jetpack troopers who would strike from the sky. Meanwhile, this was the inexperienced Fett's first taste of command, and his commandos held the extraction point. The true Mandalorians faced ferocious firepower and realized that it was a setup. However, Muriel and Fett had another problem within their own ranks that they could never have predicted. The veteran warrior Montross was extremely jealous of Muriel's affection for Fett and desired to become the next Mandalore. While Muriel trusted Montross as a loyalist, there was tension between them because of the latter's tendency toward brutality. For example, we know from the Star Wars Bounty Hunter manual that Muriel was uncomfortable with the levels of collateral damage that Montross inflicted during their operations. During this battle, Montross disobeyed Muriel's direct command to withdraw, forcing Fett to provide support to save the surviving members of Vertigo's squad. This angered Muriel, who told Montross he would no longer be a Mandalorian if they made it off the planet alive. Unfortunately, this wasn't the best timing to announce this because Muriel then came under fire from his old enemy, Vizsla. The true Mandalorian leader called Montross for an airlift, but his angry lieutenant just flew away, leaving him to die. Montross then ordered the remaining Mandalorians to retreat and claimed that Fett was trying to save Muriel. Unfortunately for him, Jango picked that moment to arrive with Muriel's body in his arms. Ultimately, Montross fled, and Jango became the Mandalore, at least in the eyes of the true Mandalorians. Jango became obsessed with gaining revenge against Tor Vizsla and the Death Watch. One day, he would achieve his desire, but it would require a lot of patience. This was a bad day for the true Mandalorians, but the good news was that most of them escaped Corta 6 alive. They went on to hunt the Death Watch and followed them to Galadran and 44 BBY. That's where Fett discovered that the planet's governor was financing Tor Vizsla's efforts to rebuild the Death Watch and was harboring his men. In Jango Fett Open Seasons, he attempted to earn the governor's loyalty by helping him in his struggle against local rebels. The true Mandalorians used their jetpacks to ambush the Galadran rebels, wiping them out on a snowy battlefield. After completing the mission, they returned to the governor's palace, where they expected the planet's leader to fulfill his side of their bargain. However, the governor refused to admit that he was harboring Vizsla. The Death Watch leader chose this moment to attack Fett with Vizsla, shooting his enemy's jetpack. Fett crash-landed in the snow far from the true Mandalorians' camp. This was bad, but it was about to get even worse for the true Mandalorians. The governor had been busy while they were away fighting rebels. He contacted the Jedi Order on Coruscant and told them that a group of Mandalorian raiders was murdering innocent women and children on his world. Death Watch generously provided the bodies as evidence for the crime. Fett saw the Jedi ships approaching, but his comm link was broken, and he couldn't contact his comrades. This forced him to run desperately through the snow in a race to reach their camp before the Jedi. He arrived just in time as a group of Jedi led by Master Dooku ordered their immediate and unconditional surrender. Dooku's Padawan, Komari Vosa, brashly told them that they would die if they didn't drop their weapons. The Mandalorians reacted to this threat exactly as you would expect, and a violent battle erupted, although they specifically targeted Vosa initially. Their Beskar armor and clinical blaster fire were effective, but the Jedi lightsabers were also devastating as they deflected energy bolts. One knight cut Fett's second-in-command in half. He was a true Mandalorian known as Miles, and one of Fett's most trusted allies. Fett avenged his fallen comrade by garroting the Jedi responsible. It was a desperate battle with the true Mandalorians firing wrist rockets at the Jedi from the air. Fett earned infamy across the galaxy during this fight because he killed a total of 6 Jedi using only his bare hands and armor. It was a magnificent achievement, even if it was extremely grim, and one that Dooku would remember. However, it was ultimately in vain because the Jedi overwhelmed the true Mandalorians and captured Fett, the sole survivor. Dooku turned him over to the governor, who proceeded to sell the Mandalore into slavery. This was a catastrophic day for the true Mandalorians, and the Death Watch took full advantage. They swiftly purged the remaining members of the true Mandalorians as they earned a brutal and crushing victory. This wasn't the end of Jango Fett's influence on the galaxy, although he would spend years in enslavement. The end of this war also left him extremely embittered, and when he eventually escaped from a spice transport, he became a solitary bounty hunter. Before we continue, I want to emphasize that this is all from Legends. The story we get in canon is that Jango hailed from Conquered Dawn and fought in the Mandalorian Civil War. We know from Chapter 14 of The Mandalorian that he had a mentor named Jast at some point, and that's basically all we get before he becomes a full-time bounty hunter. Getting back on track, this was also a major result for the Death Watch because now they could focus their efforts on destroying the new Mandalorians, the faction they despised the most. However, ironically, in their absence, the new Mandalorians had built up their society and become a developed and galactically respected culture. Death Watch was no longer at its full strength after its violent conflict with the true Mandalorians. An all-out civil war broke out on Mandalore in 44 BBY, with many clans bitterly fighting each other. During this period, Duke Adane Kryze, the leader of Clan Kryze, sent his daughter to Coruscant to receive diplomatic training. The new Mandalorians elected her as Duchess of Mandalore after the death of her father and identified her as the best prospect of bringing peace to the planet. The Jedi assigned Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi as bodyguards to protect her when she returned to the planet, a mission that lasted a full year. In the Clone Wars series, Obi-Wan muses about how Mandalorian insurgents attempted to assassinate her multiple times, so it was a dangerous mission. It's also notable because Obi-Wan built up a romantic connection to Satine, testing the limits of his devotion to the Jedi Code that cautions against attachment. Ultimately, the new Mandalorians would win the Great Clan Wars, a conflict that exists in both Legends and canon. However, there's only one major discrepancy. Death Watch already existed under Tor Vizsla in the Legends continuity. This is different from the canon timeline, where Death Watch would form on Concordia as a splinter group as a result of losing this war. It's easy to see why many people favor the Legends versions of events, because there's just so much more lore and depth. It's also worth noting that there were still traditional Mandalorians who didn't align with either political movement. Clan Awad was one notable faction of a group that would become known as the Old Mandalorians. In the adventure book Friends Like These, we learn that Nam Baroya led Clan Awad to Vlimith Port, where he established a settlement of 800 Mandalorians who specialized in mercenary work. They had no interest in the politics and feuding on Mandalore, instead focusing on contracts and earning credits. These old Mandalorians allied with the tribe of Tals and celebrated festivals with them. Eventually, a band of Zygerian slavers captured Baroya, and he became a celebrated gladiator. This element of the story is also entirely canon. However, later tales of Baroya's daughter Vera and her missions for the Rebel Alliance remain strictly legends. It's up to you which storyline you prefer, but I know what I think is better. Now we're moving deeper into territory that more Star Wars fans will be familiar with. Jango Fett eventually escaped from slavery in 44 BBY and went on a one-man mission to get revenge on Tor Vizsla. We know from Jango Fett Open Seasons 4 that his first move was to go after the governor of Galadran. After evading his bodyguards and breaking into the governor's palace, he presented his foe with a simple choice: his life or Vizsla's location. The governor saw the writing on the wall and sold out Death Watch. Fett reclaimed his Beskar armor, which the governor had taken and restored as a trophy. Then he went to Corellia, where he intercepted Vizsla's personal starship, the Death Rattle. Fett breached the ship by setting a starfighter on a direct course for its engines, crippling it. Then he breached it by using his jetpack to fly through the bridge's viewport. This set the stage for a dramatic duel with Vizsla even as the ship was going down. The sworn enemies continued fighting in an escape pod before they crashed on Corellia's surface. They exited the escape pod and battled next to a river. Vizsla stabbed Fett with a poisoned blade, but this ironically saved his life. Fett slashed Vizsla's abdomen with one of his gauntlet blades, wounding the Death Watch leader, and his blood enticed a pack of hungry dire cats. They savaged Vizsla, killing him, but they left Fett alone because they smelt the poison within him. He slipped into unconsciousness but eventually recovered. No Legends material explains how Fett recovered, but the implication is that the poison was incapacitating but not immediately lethal. We know Fett is incredibly tough, so it may be that he was just strong enough to wake up and find medical attention before succumbing to more serious symptoms. Anyway, after this, Fett stopped being a major player in the galaxy for over a decade. He didn't attempt to enforce his status as Mandalore, instead choosing exile as one of the galaxy's greatest bounty hunters. According to the novel Legacy of the Force, Sacrifice, his future clone's son, Boba, believed that killing Vizsla was the greatest deed he achieved in the name of the Mandalorians. It's also true that it removed Death Watch as a serious player on Mandalore, but it didn't destroy them completely. They retreated in a strategic disappearance, but plotted to rebuild and cause even more damage. Pre Vizsla, another member of the clan, secretly succeeded Tor as their leader, but they fell into increasing disrepute. In the Legends game Star Wars Galaxies, they even ally with criminal syndicates like Black Sun. Mandalore suffered even more damage during the Civil War, so it's easy to see why ordinary people weren't fans of the movement. It's worth noting that the Bounty Hunter Code says that Tor Vizsla had the Darksaber in his possession, but he never uses it against Fett. The simple reason for this is that it didn't exist until Dave Filoni created it for the Clone Wars series. Otherwise, we'd likely have seen Fett dueling a Darksaber-wielding Vizsla, which would have been awesome. This is also different from the canon timeline because it's about now that Pre Vizsla establishes Death Watch on Concordia, where he is the planetary governor. Remember, Tor Vizsla doesn't exist in canon, which is a shame because he's simultaneously one of the most repulsive and compelling Mandalorians. However, we don't get much background about Pre Vizsla in either continuity, except that he hated the new Mandalorians but pretended to support Duchess Satine Kryze. In the Clone Wars episode Eminence, he sums up his grievances in the following angry rant. He says, "Our people were warriors, strong, feared. Now they're ruled by the new Mandalorians, who think that being a pacifist is a good thing. They've given away our honor and tradition for peace. Duchess Satine and her corrupt leadership are crushing our souls, destroying our identity. That is our struggle." We also learn from the show that he was a direct descendant of Tar Vizsla, whom I mentioned already as the first Mandalorian Jedi. This is a part of the canon narrative that I do like, so I've got to give credit where it's due. We also know that Pre Vizsla had inherited the Darksaber, which he saw as a symbol of his status as Mandalore's true leader. The Clone Wars reveals that Pre Vizsla respected Satine Kryze's father, Adonai, as a warrior, even if he profoundly disagreed with him. However, he had nothing but contempt for Adonai's daughter and believed she was unfit to rule Mandalore. He would spend the next decades scheming from the shadows while maintaining a public veneer of loyalty. Before we continue with events on Mandalore, we should return to the adventures of Jango Fett, because he was about to have an irrevocable impact on the galaxy. At this point in Legends, he was using Jaster Muriel's old ship, a Quat Drive Yard's amphibious interstellar assault transport. According to the console game Star Wars Bounty Hunter, Fett renamed it Jaster's Legacy and flew it until shortly after the invasion of Naboo. He also took up residence at Outland Transit Station, a massive space station in Hutt space above a desolate planet. Outland Transit Station was a general den of debauchery, complete with cantinas, casinos, and gladiator arenas. Fett also partnered with a Toydarian female named Rosada, who assisted him on his missions. In 32 BBY, a human named Tyrannus approached Fett with an offer that he couldn't refuse. Tyrannus contracted several elite bounty hunters to find Komari Vosa, a former Jedi turned leader of the Bando Gora Darkside cult. If Vosa's name sounds familiar, you may remember she was Jedi Master Dooku's brash Padawan on Corta 6. Rosada warned him that they were incredibly dangerous, which is true. The Bando Gora used mind-altering neurotoxins to suppress individuality and free will. They combined this with their Force practices to create an army of mindless slaves. The Bando Gora were fanatical enough to attack Dark Plagueis' fortress, and eventually, even Sidious feared that they could interfere with his plans, so he ordered his new apprentice, Darth Tyrannus, to deal with them. Fett's former true Mandalorian comrade Montross was another of the contracted bounty hunters on the mission. Star Wars Bounty Hunter has a great storyline, and I highly recommend playing it again if you have a chance. Montross interfered in Fett's plans several times along the way, killing several witnesses. Fett allied with Zam Wesell, who would appear in Attack of the Clones and attempt to assassinate Padme Amidala. Fett later regretted that he had no choice but to silence her. He also lost Jaster's Legacy, but replaced it with a Firespray-class patrol ship that he renamed Slave One and became one of the most iconic ships in the galaxy. Montross killed Raz, one of the only beings in the galaxy who truly cared about Fett. He would go on to defeat his former comrade in a duel, but denied him a noble warrior's death, instead leaving him as prey for the Bando Gora cult, who ate him. To cut a long story short, Fett tracked Vosa to Kolma, the burial moon of Bogdan. He defeated her after an intense battle, but planned to spare her life. However, Tyrannus, who was of course Count Dooku, the former leader of the Jedi who fought Fett on Corta 6, appeared from the shadows after force choking his former apprentice to death. Then Dooku informed Fett that it was all just an orchestrated test, and the Sith Lord offered him the chance to become the template for a new clone army that would become the Grand Army of the Republic. Obviously, Fett accepted Dooku's proposal, and for a substantial fee, he donated his genes to the Kaminoan cloners in Tipoca City. Again, I need to clarify that Star Wars Bounty Hunter is not a canon story. The Bando Gora are canon, and one of their masks even appears in the Acolyte's official visual guide, although this timeline is long before the events in Bounty Hunter. There are some consistent elements, including Fett's collaboration with Zam Wesell and how he obtained Slave 1 on the prison moon, Uvu 4. Dooku also set Fett a test before selecting him as the template for the clone army. However, it is drastically different because he orders Fett to retrieve an artifact called the Hope of Glen Anselm. This was given to the Nautolan and Anselmi by the Republic after the end of an interspecies war. Ultimately, it emerges in the Jango Fett comic book series that Dooku orchestrated the heist and wanted the chaos on the planet to continue to undermine the Republic. Again, you can choose which storyline you prefer, but I know which I think is better. Anyway, both the Legends and canon continuities align briefly from this point forward as we move closer to the Clone Wars. Tyrannus and the Kaminoans retained Fett as a military consultant, and he had a profound impact on the clone army. He advised them on tactics and training, as well as clearly influencing their armor design. The Kaminoans used accelerated aging to quickly produce a force of functional troopers available for combat. We learn from Attack of the Clones that as part of the deal, Jango made the seemingly odd request of a clone of his own, with regular human aging. Boba became Jango's adopted son and one of the few beings in the galaxy he had genuine affection for. One of the main differences between the Legends and canon timelines is that Jango and Boba have more adventures together in the former. In Star Wars Adventure 6, The Warlords of Balmorra, Jango agrees to go after a consortium of criminals, including the corrupt senator of Rhodia and a Hutt crime lord, after they attempted to blow up the Fondor shipyards. This Legends mission was notable because it was one of his last in the build-up to the Clone Wars. On a previous job, Boba asked him why he took the job when the Kaminoans were already paying him a fortune. Jango made it profoundly clear that they weren't born with their reputations, but that they had to earn them. While Jango professed to love Boba, he was also extremely ruthless with the boy's training. He used him as bait on several missions and exposed him to severe danger. Everything would change when a Jedi Master named Obi-Wan Kenobi came to Kamino in 22 BBY. Kenobi had a thankless task trying to find the location of the mysterious planet that appears to be officially outside of the main Star Wars galaxy. Kenobi was investigating the attempted assassination of Naboo's senator Padme Amidala. Zam Wesell, the Claudite changeling, tried to murder the former queen, but the Jedi intervened. Fett assassinated the wounded Wesell because he couldn't risk her giving any information in return for medical assistance. Eventually, Kenobi tracked Fett, the mysterious gunman, to Kamino and uncovered the existence of the clone army. Eventually, he confronted Fett and a fight broke out between the men before Jango and Boba fled in Slave 1. This would all lead to Obi-Wan's eventual capture on Geonosis and Jango's final showdown with the Jedi. Some people question Fett's death at the hands of Mace Windu in Attack of the Clones. There are a couple of factors to keep in mind. Firstly, we know that he was born in 66 BBY, so he was 44 at the time of the arena battle on Geonosis. Even though he was still a very effective bounty hunter, it's likely that he was no longer in his physical prime. He still successfully killed at least one Jedi Master during the fight. Coleman Trebor charged at Count Dooku before Fett calmly fired his Westar 34 blaster pistols, sending Trebor over a ledge to his death. Then he flew to the arena floor where he faced Mace Windu, who dropped his lightsaber but used the Force to return it to his hand. Suddenly, a furious Reek charged at Jango, interrupting their battle. This was one of the three beasts that the Geonosians set on Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme Amidala. However, Fett's malfunctioning jetpack cost him dearly as it failed to ignite, exposing him to danger, although he managed to shoot the Reek between the eyes. Windu clinically scythed the legendary Mandalorian's head from his shoulders, ending his life. Later, Boba would mourn his father's death and bury him on Geonosis after reclaiming Jango's armor. However, we know from the Legends novel Legacy of the Force Bloodlines that Boba eventually reburied Jango on Mandalore. He was never the same after this, in canon or Legends, and always carried a darkness in his heart. To be fair, watching your father getting decapitated in front of you will do that. Nonetheless, his father's influence remained profound. In one episode of the Clone Wars, Honda Ohnaka convinces Boba to give precious information to Jedi Master Plo Koon, because it's what Jango would have done. He had his own moral code, and it remained his driving force. Jango Fett's legacy is a tricky one, because his significance to the Mandalorians is different depending on which continuity you're focusing on. I've already stated that he held the title of Mandalore before his self-imposed exile as the galaxy's top bounty hunter. However, he never achieved this rank in Legends, with Prime Minister Almec even referring to him as a common bounty hunter, and questioning how he even got that armor. This is a curious contradiction because most canon sources accept that he was a legitimate Mandalorian foundling, even if there's no evidence that he was Mandalore. Nonetheless, there's no doubt that he was an elite warrior and played a crucial role in one of the most destructive conflicts in galactic history. Also, a gladiatorial arena was built on Tatooine in honor of his legacy. Boba would follow in his father's footsteps and even attempt to assassinate Mace Windu. However, he wouldn't become a significant figure in Mandalorian society until much later in his life, and only in the Legends timeline. Now it's time to return to Mandalore itself and see what was happening as the Clone Wars exploded to life. Again, there are deviances between canon and Legends, so let's start with the former. We know from the Clone Wars show that Mandalore remained outside of the conflict for most of the conflict. That was thanks to the Duchess Satine Kryze, leader of the new Mandalorians, who was determined that her planet would become prosperous again. According to the canon sourcebook Rise of the Separatists, Mandalore led the Council of Neutral Planets, a status that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. Usually, if a Mandalorian hadn't started the war, they were happy to join in. Anyway, the Separatists and the Republic both poured intense pressure on the Mandalorians to join their respective causes, but the Mandalorians resisted. This is a difference from the Legends versions of events, which suggests that some Mandalorians continued training ARC troopers after Jango Fett's death. In Republic Commando 000, the Jedi Master Arlagan Zay said, "I think it's significant that the casualty rate among commando squads trained by Mandalorians is lower than those trained by other races. Somehow, Mandalorians imbue their charges with a sense of purpose, self-confidence, and an almost obsessive sense of clan, of family, that gives them a genuine survival advantage. Let us be thankful they're on our side this time." Other legend sources also suggest that Mandalore fought with the Separatists, but canon clearly emphasizes that this was not their mainstream position. The Death Watch indeed assisted Count Dooku's forces as they sought to bring down Kryze and her supporters. The Mandalorian people bore many physical and mental scars after decades of civil war, with some poorer provinces still struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, there was a monument in the capital city commemorating both new and true Mandalorians alike after the Civil War, in a bid to reconcile warring clans and remind them of the pain they shared. However, Kryze didn't know that the Concordian governor Pre Vizsla was actively plotting against her. He orchestrated several terror attacks to undermine her position by swaying public opinion against her. On the surface, Vizsla appeared to be hunting the members of Death Watch and a Kryze supporter. However, he literally hid them underground in the mines of Concordia, where they strengthened and forged new armor. One of Vizsla's successes was the recruitment of Bo-Katan Kryze, the Duchess's sister, who believed in Mandalore's warrior past. Vizsla placed her in command of the Night Owls, an elite group of female Mandalorian warriors. Collapse of the Republic explains how Death Watch worked as mercenaries as they awaited the right moment to strike. This also gave them valuable battlefield experience before they engaged with Kryze's legitimate government. Meanwhile, Vizsla secretly declared himself Mandalore, pointing to his heritage as a descendant of the Jedi Tar Vizsla and his possession of the Darksaber. The Clone Wars represented a golden opportunity for Vizsla as he plotted his rise to power. He secretly collaborated with Count Dooku, who realized that an army of highly skilled Mandalorian warriors would be a very helpful addition to his forces. However, by this point, the new Mandalorians had several treaties in place with the Republic, and also enjoyed their support during the Civil War. This was one of the reasons why the Republic believed that Satine Kryze owed them and didn't have much patience for her obstinate neutrality. Mandalore was also strategically significant because of its location on the Hydian Way hyperlane, and would have been a perfect staging ground for Republic forces. Dooku's backing gave the Death Watch the momentum it needed to become a serious force on Mandalore. Ironically, Kryze even tasked Vizsla with rooting the organization out, allowing him to easily cover his tracks. The Star Wars Encyclopedia explains how Dooku and Vizsla wanted to force a Republic occupation. This would simultaneously turn the public against Kryze's pacifist government by making them appear weak. It would also trigger mass resentment against an invading foreign power and allow Death Watch to appear as liberators. We see how Death Watch stepped up their terrorist attacks, including one lone wolf's failed attempt to blow up a Republic ship before taking his own life. Eventually, they even circulated the false rumors that Satine Kryze was building an army for the Separatists in a brilliantly devious twist. However, this had the unforeseen effect of the Jedi Council sending Obi-Wan Kenobi to investigate the situation on the ground. Yes, the same Obi-Wan Kenobi who had a romantic alliance with Kryze and knew she would never join the Separatists. He was also the same Obi-Wan Kenobi that Count Dooku maintained a soft spot for and tried to recruit in Attack of the Clones. Vizsla was displeased to note that Kenobi's appearance on Mandalore didn't bother Dooku at all. However, the Sith Lord maintained his commitment to supporting the Death Watch, and they soon bombed the memorial shrine in Sundari. As Kryze, Obi-Wan, and her bodyguards were in the Peace Park at the time, they responded quickly to the incident. Again, the perpetrator committed suicide, but before he did, he spoke to Kryze in Concordian, inadvertently revealing his origin. This prompted Kenobi to request a visit to Concordia as part of his investigation. Vizsla greeted them when they arrived and maintained his facade of being a loyal governor. The Jedi Master became suspicious of Vizsla and decided to investigate the mines that night, but Death Watch operatives captured him, forcing Kryze to rescue him. Vizsla pursued them, accepting that this would definitely blow his cover. After ruthlessly executing one of his own men, Vizsla activated the Darksaber and dueled Kenobi. However, he underestimated the Force user and even lost his grip on his blade before recovering it. The Mandalorian warrior fought back, forcing Kenobi to the ground before activating his jetpack with the intention of striking him down from above. But Kenobi force-jumped into the air, battering his opponent and driving him away. Vizsla realized his mortal danger and ordered his men to intervene by firing missiles from their jetpacks. Kenobi and Kryze made their escape down a mine shaft in a major blow for Vizsla. It's fair to say that this wasn't the way Vizsla expected Mandalore in the galaxy to learn his true allegiance. It instantly put him on the back foot, forcing Death Watch to flee their bases for another encampment on Concordia. Vizsla also raged at Count Dooku because he wanted to launch a direct assault on Sundari. However, the more pragmatic and rational Sith Lord correctly informed him that even if they won the battle, they'd hold the city for a day before the Republic swept through. However, as Dooku correctly surmised, these events stimulated Republic interest, with the Galactic Senate actively debating the forced occupation of Mandalore. This prompted Kryze to travel to Coruscant to defend her planet's right to neutrality. Vizsla then ordered the treacherous Mandalorian Senator Merrick to assassinate Kryze, but he failed, despite hijacking and sabotaging her ship. Meanwhile, the Death Watch bombed Kryze's homeworld, Kalevala, and assassinated Mandalore's Deputy Prime Minister Carrick, one of her most trusted confidants. An exhausted Kryze faced several more attempts against her life on Coruscant, but she survived. Her enemies also doctored Carrick's account on the situation on Mandalore, turning the Senate against her. Ultimately, Kryze successfully found the truth and presented evidence that convinced the Senator not to occupy Mandalore, as she secured her planet's independence, at least in the short term. This enraged Vizsla, who believed that Dooku failed to fulfill his promises, and the Sith Lord responded by scarring the Mandalorian's face with his lightsaber. The Clone Wars character encyclopedia confirms that his mental state began to seriously deteriorate at this point, while Death Watch also diminished. The next major event in Mandalorian history was yet another major civil war. In 19 BBY, Pre-Vizsla and the Death Watch allied with Darth Maul and the Shadow Collective. The Death Watch had kept their heads down for a couple of years, taking a few missions as ruthless mercenaries, but they came back with a bloody vengeance as they staged a dramatic coup to remove Duchess Satine. However, Maul had no aspirations of suddenly becoming a team player, so he challenged Vizsla to a duel with the winner earning the right to rule Mandalore. The former Sith Lord killed the Mandalorian in single combat, although some members of Death Watch weren't on board with this. Bo-Katan Kryze rebelled against Maul's rule and formed a new faction, the Mandalore Resistance. It's worth noting that despite their association with the Death Watch, Bo-Katan was more of a true Mandalorian in spirit. We see in the Clone Wars series how the Battle of Mandalore broke out in Sundari between Maul's Mandalorian Super Commandos and Bo-Katan's Resistance. Obi-Wan Kenobi was also present as he rushed to save the deposed Duchess Satine. They faced another challenge when Prime Minister Almec attempted to cover up Maul's crimes and frame Satine as Pre Vizsla's murderer. Obi-Wan successfully freed Satine from prison, but Maul's forces blocked their escape. Then Maul killed Satine in front of Obi-Wan out of pure spite in one of Star Wars' most shocking on-screen scenes. His super commandos captured the heartbroken Jedi Master, but Bo-Katan's defenders liberated him. Maul's coup came to a dramatic end when Darth Sidious himself arrived in the city and confronted his former apprentice in a stunning lightsaber battle. He killed Maul's Zabrak brother, Savage Opress, and defeated Maul, forcing him into submission. You might think that was the end, but of course there's always more drama. Sidious imprisoned Maul in the Spire, a mountainous fortress on the hidden world of Stygian Prison. We know from the Darth Maul Son of Dathomir series that they brutally interrogated him before his former Death Watch followers liberated him. Maul faced General Grievous and the Separatist droid army, but was unable to directly rule Mandalore again. His brutal execution of Satine Kryze turned the planet against him. However, he maintained a pernicious influence through Prime Minister Almec, who was basically a figurehead. Mandalorian resistance leader Bo-Katan was desperate for Republic support to liberate the planet from Maul once and for all. Eventually, the Republic agreed to send aid in Commander Rex, Ahsoka Tano, and the new 332nd Company of Clone Troopers. The 332nd was a subdivision of the 501st Legion, with many of their troopers painting their helmets with orange markings in tribute to Tano. It's also worth noting that Tano technically didn't hold any military rank during this engagement because she had already left the Jedi Order. All of this appears in the Clone Wars series, with Obi-Wan also advising Tano to capture Maul instead of killing him. The evidence suggests that there is genuinely a better chance of blowing up a Death Star than of permanently eliminating Maul. The Siege of Mandalore began with the arrival of 3 Republic Venator-class Star Destroyers. Then an attack force of lot gunships and troops landed on the planet, and the Battle of Sundari began. It's worth noting that Almec complained that the Republic invasion broke a 1,000-year-old treaty. This is obviously incompatible with the Legends timeline, and is a reminder of the deviances between the two continuities, even when some events remain consistent. This was a devastating battle that wreaked havoc across Mandalore, burning many of its plazas. The combined Mandalorian resistance and Republic forces took Sundari's shopping docks before proceeding into the Undercity. Maul confronted Tano in the darkness before her clone reinforcements arrived, and he retreated. This was also the first time she heard the name Darth Sidious. I won't go too deep into the galactic politics aspect, but it's enough to say that Maul ambushed a squad of clone troopers and ruthlessly forced Jesse to divulge what information about Ahsoka he knew. Meanwhile, the Mandalorians were evacuating civilians from the city. Then Bo-Katan led her forces into the palace throne room, where Maul waited for them with the unfortunate Jesse. He blocked Bo-Katan's blaster bolts with the Force before attempting to choke her. Ultimately, the situation evolved into a duel between Ahsoka and Maul, with the Mandalorians returning to the greater battle outside. The clones and Ahsoka would defeat Maul and capture him before bringing him off-world on a Venator Star Destroyer. His imprisonment wouldn't last long because Order 66 was imminent and gave him the chance to escape again. Meanwhile, Bo-Katan would become Regent of Mandalore, but the rise of the new Galactic Empire meant that her reign would be short-lived. Before we continue, I want to do a quick sidebar on a Legends storyline from Order 66, a Republic Commando novel. This takes us back to before the Battle of Geonosis, when an ARC trooper nicknamed Spar began experiencing memories from Jango Fett's life. He deserted the clone army in the hold of Fett's ship and began working as a bounty hunter himself. Eventually, after Fett's death, he would declare himself Jango's rightful heir and win over the new Mandalorians. Spar took the name Mandalore the Resurrector and overturned the new Mandalorian policy of neutrality. Instead, he supported the Separatists because he resented the Jedi for killing Jango. Mandalore the Resurrector reintroduced Jaster Mareel's Super Commando Codex and created a new order of warriors he called the Mandalorian Protectors. These even included some former members of the Death Watch. The Mandalorian Protectors defeated the Republic on several worlds before launching a raid on Kamino that severely damaged the cloning facilities. Eventually, Darth Sidious handpicked the Protectors for a mission to assassinate or capture Padme Amidala. However, it was a double bluff, because he backstabbed them by having Republic forces ready and waiting for the Mandalorian Protectors to arrive. They devastated the Mandalorians, leaving only 3 alive: Spar, Fen Shaisa, and Dala. The psychologically scarred Spar gave up his title of Mandalore before Shaisa reluctantly took up his mantle. Obviously, none of this aligns with the storyline we receive in The Mandalorian or the Book of Boba Fett, but it's still fascinating. Don't forget about Shaisa because we'll be coming back to him again later. Now we're moving on to the period of Imperial domination. This is where legends and canon diverge completely, with almost no overlap. In canon, Bo-Katan became the regent of Mandalore, but then the Empire came along and literally destroyed everything. Former Maul loyalist Gar Saxon led his Imperial supercommandos back to Mandalore in 2 BBY, and they soundly defeated the Protectors. That same year, Sabine Wren, a Mandalorian member of a rebel cell, found the Darksaber on Dathomir and began training with it. This would be crucial for what was to come because of the Darksaber's symbolic importance and equivalence to Mandalore's mask in Legends. She returned to her clan's stronghold on the icy Mandalorian world of Cronest and attempted to convince her mother, Duchess Ursa Wren, to ally with the rebellion. Duchess Wren refused and initially betrayed Sabine's companions to Gar Saxon in exchange for her daughter's safety. However, Saxon branded the entire clan as enemies of Mandalore and attacked her. Sabine reclaimed the Darksaber and Ursa killed Saxon, creating yet another power vacuum on Mandalore. Later, we know from Star Wars Rebels that Clan Wren would rise against Clan Saxon and fight yet another civil war. They allied themselves with the likes of Clan Kryze under Bo-Katan and Clan Vizsla, amongst many others. Then Sabine offered Bo-Katan the Darksaber. The former regent first refused because she believed she was not the leader her sister was, but eventually she would accept. This alienated a faction of radical Mandalorians known as the Children of the Watch, who believed that she had cursed their race by not winning the Darksaber in combat. Now seems like a good time to do a sidebar on the Children of the Watch because they obviously heavily feature in The Mandalorian. Bo-Katan described this orthodox group as a cult because they followed ancient Mandalorian teachings known as the Way of the Mandalore. One of their most notable traits was never removing their helmet in front of another living being. This made the practical aspects of daily life, like eating, quite tricky. However, the consequences of removing the helmet were severe because the group would cast the perpetrator out and no longer consider them Mandalorian. An exception was made for their younglings who could not recite their creed. The words of the creed included the following lines: "I swear on my name and the names of the ancestors that I shall walk the way of the Mandalore, and the words of the creed shall be forever forged in my heart. This is the way." This will be familiar to anyone who has watched The Mandalorian because this subculture features heavily in the series. Meanwhile, followers of the Way believed that their foundlings were the future and reserved precious Beskar for them. Eventually, when the foundling came of age, they would go through an initiation ceremony with a helmet placed on their head, never to be removed in public again. One of the most notable groups of the Children of the Watch lived underground on the planet Navarro. They included the Armorer, the symbolic leader of their covert, who forged their armor, sigils, and even weapons. Another notable affiliate was Paz Vizsla, showing that even mainstream Mandalorian clans had members in this secret cult. We also know that many of their members didn't realize that there were other Mandalorians and believed that they were following standard doctrine. This was definitely Din Djarin's situation because he didn't know there was anything unusual about their practices until he encountered Bo-Katan Kryze and her forces. The Children of the Watch found themselves in a direct confrontation with Moff Gideon's Imperial remnant after Din Djarin rescued a Jedi youngling Grogu. Eventually, he gave Grogu to the care of Luke Skywalker, but the youngster wished to return to Djarin and be a Mandalorian. Again, as I emphasized, this is entirely consistent with Legends and canon lore, because many species have adopted Mandalorian principles throughout millennia of galactic history. Ultimately, the Children of the Watch united with Bo-Katan's Mandalorians to retake Mandalore from the Imperial remnant. Let's jump back to how the Empire took control of Mandalorian canon in the first place. Bo-Katan Kryze became Mandalore after defeating Clan Saxon and uniting the clans. According to friends like these, some old Mandalorians would also support the Rebel Alliance at the Battle of Zorn. However, this triggered the Empire into ruthless action. They concluded that they would never be able to subdue the Mandalorians, so they decided to commit genocide instead. The Great Purge of Mandalore took place between 4 and 5 BBY, wiping out most of the planet's population. After bombing Mandalore and obliterating the people, they extracted as much Beskar as possible. Some groups, such as the Children of the Watch, emerged unscathed because they were off-world. The worst part of the destruction occurred on the Night of 1,000 Tears. The Book of Boba Fett explains that TIE bombers laid waste to Mandalore cities, including Sundari, the capital. Meanwhile, Imperials believe that they destroyed the precious mines of Mandalore, but instead they caused major flooding, forcing the living waters to rise as we see in The Mandalorian. Much later, Kryze would discover an actual mythosaur living under the planet's surface. During the Purge, ISB officer Gideon, a future Moff, negotiated with Bo-Katan. He offered a ceasefire in return for the unconditional surrender and disarmament of the Mandalorian people. In return, he guaranteed the safety of the surviving population and an end to the bombing. Kryze accepted the shame that surrender would bring, but recognized the survival of her people was at stake. She gave up the Darksaber as a symbol of submission, but Gideon betrayed her and took the ancient lightsaber for himself. The Imperials continued their bombardment, forcing the few surviving Mandalorians into a prolonged exile. I've already touched on how Bo-Katan and Din Djarin liberated Mandalore from Gideon and his forces, defeating him in a duel before cleaning themselves in the living waters. The Darksaber was also destroyed in this fight, which was probably a good thing, because it tended to corrupt the spirit of those who carried it. All of this came after they also helped Boba Fett and his criminal syndicate conquer Tatooine. I won't go into detail about that because I don't think this incident is particularly consequential to Mandalorian history beyond getting Fett on their side. This is pretty much where the canon history of Mandalore ends, because we don't get much about the Mandalorians in the sequel trilogy. Let's jump back to the Legends timeline because this is drastically different and extends much longer than canon. Firstly, it's crucial to note that the Great Purge of Mandalore never took place in the Legends continuity. The Empire had a very different relationship with the Mandalorians, as we see in Order 66, a Republic Commando novel. They offered the Mandalorians work as mercenaries and even leased land on Mandalore for a major garrison. However, the peace was never going to last forever. Finn Shaisa reluctantly assumed the title of Mandalore, primarily because he didn't trust Emperor Palpatine. However, he accepted the Imperial base simply because he believed the Empire would just take the land by force anyway and repress the Mandalorian people. The Empire's insidious nature revealed itself when they offered Mandal Motors 800 million credits for exclusive mining rights in the Beskar ore-rich Tokarsh region. They planned to use it to reinforce their prison ships with enhancements like Beskar manacles and chains for the Jedi Purge. Gradually, the Imperials increased their presence and control of the planet. Shaisa recognized the growing threat and quietly created a resistance force to respond if the situation escalated. Eventually, it did, with Imperials practicing mass slavery and strip mining Mandalore. Shaisa's protectors fought against the Empire for the next 20 years, while Mandalore also became the target of pirate gangs, including the Zan Consortium. The Mandalore led many hit-and-run raids against slavers and Imperial convoys, but matters escalated when the enemy captured his lieutenant and close friend, Tabi Dala, who was trying to release captured Mandalorian slaves. A determined Shaisa desperately wanted to liberate Dala. In the original Marvel Star Wars comic book series, the Empire then sent the bounty hunter Dengar after Shaisa, but his Mandalorians captured him. Shaisa then struck a deal with the Imperial slavers to trade Dengar for Dala. However, then Princess Leia arrived on the planet in pursuit of Dengar because she believed that he had helped Boba Fett capture Han Solo. Leia immediately became involved in a shootout with the Mandalorians and the slavers, mistaking Shaisa for Boba Fett. Eventually, she spoke with Shaisa, who noted her resemblance to her mother, a previous target of his in the Clone Wars. Leia begged Shaisa to give her Dengar, but he refused. She distracted him by kissing him before knocking him unconscious and freeing the bounty hunter. However, Dengar double-crossed her and betrayed her to the Imperials, despite agreeing to give her the information she wanted. Shaisa and his men pursued Princess Leia and saw the double cross. The Mandalorian leader donned stormtrooper armor and infiltrated the Imperial base, freeing her and Dala. To cut a long story short, Dala received a fatal shot to the chest during their escape, although he succeeded in sabotaging Shrike Squadron and blowing up the Imperial base. This rid Mandalore of the Empire's core presence on the planet and pushed the Mandalorians closer to the Rebel Alliance. Shaisa also recaptured Dengar and forced him to give Organa the information she needed. He would maintain a soft spot for the Alderaanian princess throughout the comic book series, pushing him into tension with Han Solo. This escalated when the Mandalorians came to the aid of the Alliance of Free Planets after the Dark Lady Lumia invaded the galaxy with the Nagai. the Mandalorians played a crucial role in defending the alliance of free planets against the looming threat. However, it became clear that the Nagai were fleeing the threat of the barbaric Toph, so the Mandalorian protectors helped to liberate their world. Shisa's tenure as Mandalore came to a violent end in 21 BBY. This came after a Kaminoan named Taun We enlisted Boba Fett to track Shisa down and kill him in revenge for the Protector's attack on Kamino so many years ago. Yes, I'm talking about the same Taun We who welcomed Obi-Wan Kenobi to see the Republic's new clone army. Fett had returned to Kamino to replace his cancerous leg and agreed to the contract. In Legacy of the Force, Bloodlines, he pursued Shisa to the planet Shogun. Before they could fight, they came under attack from Sevets. Shisa saved Boba's life because he believed a member of the Fett clan should be the true Mandalore. However, he suffered severe wounds in the process. Boba killed him out of mercy rather than leave him to a gruesome and rotten death. But most significantly, as we read in Legacy of the Force Revelation, he agreed to become Mandalore. This raised him far beyond his status as a mere daimyo of criminal organization on Tatooine and canon. Fett remembered his father Jango's mantra that his word was his bond, and took Shisa's helmet in tribute to the long-serving Mandalore. Little did he know that he was about to lead the Mandalorians during one of the greatest periods of violence in galactic history. Meanwhile, Shisa died as a hero to most Mandalorians because he led his people out of Imperial slavery, while he also revived the dignity and prosperity of their culture. Fett installed a monument on Mandalore in tribute to his fallen predecessor. It won't surprise anybody to learn that the Mandalorians evolved under Fett when he emerged as Mandalore in 23 ABY. Shisa's protectors were no longer primarily a defensive force. Instead, Fett used them more aggressively as mercenaries for hire. This was also the end of his legendary and at times notorious 45-year career as a bounty hunter. However, he had a baptism of fire when the Yuuzhan Vong agent Na Manor contacted him in 24 ABY and outlined his race's plans for the galaxy. In the e-novella Boba Fett, A Practical Man, Anor invited Fett on board one of the Yuuzhan Vong ships in a bid to convince the Mandalorians to work with them to conquer the galaxy. In return, they would leave Mandalorian space alone. However, the Mandalorians quickly realized that this was a bad deal when they witnessed the Yuuzhan Vong torture a Twi'lek captive. After successfully liberating the Jedi Kubariat, they worked with New Republic intelligence and agreed to pose as mercenaries for the Vong. Fett would even go as far as training Yuuzhan Vong militias on Raxus Prime, as he proved that he was every bit the practical man. However, he wasn't stupid, and he knew that the Yuuzhan Vong represented a horrific threat to the galaxy as they terraformed and devastated planets, including Ithor and the core worlds of Duro and Coruscant. They were never going to be able to coexist, but it was all about choosing the right time to make their stand and defend Mandalorian interests. Eventually, the Mandalorians blew their cover, and the Yuuzhan Vong sought to exact a violent price for the betrayal. In Legacy of the Force Sacrifice, they attacked Mandalore and unleashed carnage. They poisoned the soil and wiped out at least a third of the population while decimating its cities. However, the Mandalorians are nothing if not resilient, and retreated to the underground tunnels in the countryside. This enabled them to survive the initial attack before they re-emerged and drove off the invaders. The furious Mandalorians stepped up their campaign against the Yuuzhan Vong and worked closely with the Republic against the Galactic invaders. Boba Fett even saved his old rival Han Solo in an attack on Kalula Station. Solo would in turn save Fett before they ultimately lost Kalula to the Vong. Many of the Mandalorians scalped the Yuuzhan Vong they killed, as we learn from the novel The Unifying Force. The Republic and its Mandalorian allies would also ultimately emerge victorious in the conflict against the Yuuzhan Vong, albeit at the cost of trillions of lives, including the legendary Wookiee Chewbacca. A decade after the war, Mandalore was still suffering from the scars of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. The soil remained poisoned, and the planet was underpopulated with poor infrastructure and weak defenses. Meanwhile, as we learn from Legacy of the Force Bloodlines, Boba Fett was dying from a spreading cancer as a result of his time inside the Sarlacc, and his clone biology escalated the disease. At the time, he was living on Taris, a planet that fans of Knights of the Old Republic will know well. After a doctor gave him a year to live, he was determined not to give in without a fight. He planned to find the research of a dead Kaminoan known as Kosai. During his journey, Corellian President Thraken Sal Solo contracted him and his Mandalorian protectors to defend Centerpoint Station. This raised tensions on Mandalore, whose people wanted to focus on rebuilding the planet instead of fighting other beings' wars. Sal Solo had also put a bounty on his cousin Han, and Fett's daughter Aaylan had taken the job. Ultimately, this would turn on its head with Fett, Han, and Aaylan killing Sal Solo instead. Unfortunately, Jacen Solo would later brutally kill Aaylan, creating tension between the families. However, he had fallen to the dark side, so Fett didn't hold it personally against Han and Leia Organa too much. In the novel Legacy of the Force Sacrifice, Fett is the one who realizes what was happening to Jacen because of his close earlier association with Darth Vader during the Imperial era. Tragically, this awareness couldn't help him save his daughter, despite their complex relationship. Fett returned to Mandalore with his formerly estranged granddaughter, Murta Gev. They buried Aaylan alongside the repatriated body of Boba's father, Jango. Soon, Fett faced more practical matters, such as deciding if the Mandalorians would take a side in the next Galactic War. Fett's practical solution was that Mandalore would remain neutral as a political entity, but any warrior wishing to sell their services could do so. Meanwhile, in Legacy of the Force Sacrifice, Fett put out a call for 2 million Mandalorians to return to the planet to help retrieve it. He also agreed on a significant deal with the Verpines to trade precious Mandalorian Beskar in exchange for exclusive Verpine technology and weapons. He would eventually find a cure for his ailments, and this gave him a revived sense of urgency. Fett poured many of the profits of his bounty hunting career into the economy of Mandalore and supported the development of Mandal Motors' Besalik assault fighter. This ship incorporated Beskar into its airframe and armor, providing extreme durability. Fett decided that any government could bid for the ship as long as they could meet the price. Bothawai also contracted the Mandalorians to provide an assault force for the grand fee of 20 million credits per month. In 41 ABY, Jaina Solo, daughter of Leia and Han, came to Mandalore in search of Boba's aid to capture her estranged brother Jacen after he fell to the dark side and became Darth Caedus. Jacen flirted with the dark side during the Yuuzhan Vong War, but he became Sith after a year-long descent into chaos. This was a horrific situation for Jaina, who had already lost her younger brother Anakin to the Yuuzhan Vong. However, he died a hero, so this scenario was arguably even worse for her and the Solo Skywalker family. Legacy of the Force Revelation shows that Fett agreed to train Jaina in anti-Jedi combative techniques and bounty hunting strategies. Fett was relentlessly brutal in his treatment of her, but Jaina put up with it because she was determined to free the galaxy from her twin brother's evil influence. Later, Admiral Dalla contracted Fett's forces to act as a standby for Admiral Palaeon's forces at Fondor. Darth Caedus' apprentice, Tahiri Vela, killed the former Imperial Admiral, so the Mandalorians stormed his flagship, the Bloodfin. Fett's granddaughter Murta had gradually built up a strong relationship with Jaina. The pair led the assault, and Murta dueled Tahiri Vela, slicing her femoral artery with a vibroblade. However, the appearance of Caedus changed everything, and he attempted to force-choke Murta to death. Jaina managed to break his grip, and together she fled with the Mandalorians back to Coruscant. The Mandalorians now fully respected Jaina because she proved her bravery and loyalty to them. Her relationship with Fett remained cold, but he was more tolerant of her. Fascinatingly, in the novel, he would proceed to explain how he saw little difference between the Jedi and Sith in practice. Maybe Fett was the wisest being in the galaxy after everything he experienced. Jaina accompanied Fett and the Mandalorians to the planet Roche after the Verpine came under attack from Darth Caedus' Galactic Alliance forces. Fett sent a team, including Murta, to wipe out the Imperial Moffs with some success until Darth Caedus intervened. He dueled against Jaina, losing an arm in the battle, but the Mandalorians suffered heavy losses and Murta was captured. Caedus captured her, breaking her spine during the fight with a Force Slam, and he also created a uniquely deadly weapon to be used against the Fett clan. He drew biological samples from Murta and gave them to a scientist in the Imperial Remnant to create a nanovirus that would wipe out everybody in her bloodline. Meanwhile, the Sith Lord also manipulated her into believing that her grandfather knowingly sent her on a suicide mission. Caedus released the virus on Mandalore, but it didn't affect Fett because he was off-world. It prevented him from returning to the planet again. One morbidly fascinating question is what would have happened to the surviving children of any clones if they went to the planet? We simply don't know, but we can speculate. In Legacy of the Force Invincible, Jaina finally defeated her brother, killing him and destroying the Sith again. She also successfully rescued Murda and gave her to the care of the Mandalorians, who received Bacta treatment for her injuries, including her broken back. Incredibly, Dalla became Chief of State of the Galactic Alliance in 41 ABY. Nobody failed upwards in the Star Wars galaxy quite like the former Imperial Admiral. The Jedi would imprison her for crimes against the Alliance during the war, but Fett rescued her in Fate of the Jedi Conviction. He used a decoy of himself and Slave One during the mission with great success. As payment, he asked Dalla to find a cure for the virus that was blocking him from returning to Mandalore. Anyway, while the Jedi Order was one of the big losers in this scenario, it worked well for the Mandalorians. She contracted them to hunt rogue Jedi, including Seth Heflin, and hired them as elite operatives and for intelligence gathering. This is basically where Fett's story stops in Legends after Conviction's publication in 2011. We never learn of his fate or whether Dalla repaid her debt, allowing the Mandalore to return to the land of his people. I think it's fair to say that the development of Fett's story in Legends is far more satisfying than the canon version, where he basically succeeds Jabba the Hutt as Tatooine's main crime boss. Some fans reasonably believe that the Book of Boba Fett TV series diminishes some of his mystique. At least in the Legends version, he becomes a galactic player and has a crucial role in bringing down a powerful Sith Lord. The fact that he actually trains Han Solo's daughter is a fantastic twist. There are some issues with the Legends representation of the bounty hunter though, especially when it comes to his armor. The canon explanation is both simpler and more satisfying in this case because Boba retrieves his father Jango's Beskar Mandalorian armor. It's true that he changes the color and appears to take pride in the visible wear and gradual fading of the paint job, as evidence of countless missions. However, the 1998 magazine Star Wars Boba Fett claims that he wore Duraplast armor throughout the original trilogy, but switched to Durasteel by 25 ABY. It wasn't until 40 ABY in Legends that Fett received a new armor set made from Mandalorian iron deposits. It included a new gorget that the makers noticed could save him from the same fate as his father because it could stop lightsaber strikes. This proved to be the case in Legacy of the Force Revelations when Jaina almost decapitated him when he approached her from behind without declaring his presence. However, in both continuities, his primary weapon was his distinctive EE-3 carbine rifle, which he also used his Z-6 jetpack, flamethrower, wrist rockets, and a whipcord launcher in true Mandalorian style. We're almost at the end of this incredible journey, but there's one more period of Mandalorian history left that we can briefly touch on. They played a role in the Sith Imperial War that took place in 127 ABY. Again, this is obviously complete Legends, but it shows how, more than a century after the adventures of Luke Skywalker and the events of the original trilogy, the Mandalorians remained a credible force in the galaxy. At this point, Chernin Ordo held the title of Mandalore. It's never explicitly said, but he likely was a descendant of Darth Revan's companion Canderous Ordo, another former Mandalore. In the Star Wars Legacy comic book series, the Galactic Alliance contracted the Mandalorians to protect the planet Botajef from an impending attack by the Fel Empire. This was the latest form of the Imperial Remnant, although it had drastically evolved over the decades into a credible alternative government. However, they eventually came under the pernicious influence of the Twi'lek Sith Lord Darth Krayt and rose against the Galactic Alliance. Initially, the role of the Mandalorians was to hold Botajef until Alliance forces could relieve them, but the Imperials overran them with a massive army. Meanwhile, there was a traitor in their midst, Yaga Ox, who served another secret master. Ox sabotaged the Mandalorian communications during the battle with catastrophic results. They were no longer able to contact the Alliance, and the Imperials overwhelmed them with AT-AR walkers. Imperial forces slew Ordo with Ox usurping the title of Mandalore. However, another Mandalorian, Hondo Kar, survived the battle by swapping his armor for a stormtrooper's. He masqueraded as an Imperial in the 407th Stormtrooper Division for a decade until he attacked Darth Malevel while defending one of his officers. The evil Malevel put Kar's commanding officer through a cruel loyalty test by ordering him to kill his own brother. The unfortunate Lieutenant Gil refused the order, so Malevel simply killed both siblings. This enraged Kar, who attacked the Quarren Sith Lord, but Malevel struck back with his Electro Whip before another trooper shot him in the back. Kar fled the Empire and joined the Galactic Alliance Remnant and became a member of Rogue Squadron. The Mandalorian had a significant involvement in many high-risk missions, including the hijacking of the advanced Star Destroyer Imperius. After over 10 years of separation, he finally found his former wife, Tess Vivek, again, although she initially believed he betrayed their people. Luckily, Karr convinced her of the truth, and she relented. Soon he would leave Rogue Squadron and don a set of black and gold Mandalorian armor, the color's traditional colors of justice and vengeance. His mission was simple, to make Ox pay for his crimes against the Mandalorian people. Unfortunately, the Legends comic book series ended in 2013 and left the Mandalorian storyline unconcluded, so what happened next is left entirely to your imagination. Did Karr defeat Ox and become the new Mandalore, or did he fail on his mission, leaving the ruthless Sith sympathizer unopposed? That's entirely down to your headcanon. This is also where the Mandalorian timeline abruptly stops in Legends. We simply don't know what happens to these fascinating people and their culture after this point. However, it is worth going to 3951 BBY in Knights of the Old Republic 2, when the former Jedi Kreia, who became the Sith Darth Traya, delivered a haunting prophecy. She said, "They will die a death that will last millennia, until all that remains is their code, their history, and in the end, the shell of their armor upon the shell of a man, too easily slain by Jedi." In short, she foresaw that the Mandalorians would die until only one man was left before he too fell at the hands of a Jedi Knight, the traditional Mandalorian enemy. Before we wrap this video up, I want to briefly discuss the evolution of the Mandalorians and their legacy in the Star Wars galaxy. Most Star Wars fans love the Mandalorians for several key reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, they're some of the most awesome warriors in the franchise with amazing weapons and armor. Throughout Star Wars, they're capable of going head-to-head and holding their own against powerful Force users, including Sith and Jedi. This is a rarity in Star Wars, where the Force users typically have an advantage. From their success against the Republic and the Jedi during the Neo-Crusader era to Jango Fett defeating 6 Jedi single-handedly, they're epic fighters. On a cultural level, Mandalorians also are fascinating because they have an inherent moral ambiguity. This indeed evolved over millennia from the sheer violence and brutality of the ancient Tong, who deified war itself, to Jaster Mareel's Super Commando Codex. Even when they fought alongside the Sith, the Mandalorians still maintained a sense of honor. Mandalore the Vindicated is a prime example because despite his affiliation with the Sith Empire, he maintained an intense respect and reverence amongst the Mandalorian clans. He didn't fully trust the Sith Empire, but believed that by fighting alongside them, he was doing the right thing for Mandalore. Meanwhile, there's often a sense that because Mandalorians often fought as mercenaries throughout their history, they had no honor or morals. Jaster Mareel brilliantly dispelled this myth with the following explanation that we read in Order 66, a Republic Commando novel. He said, "So what's wrong with being a mercenary? Is your war worth fighting? If it is, then why does it matter who fights it for you? Aren't we imbued with the righteousness of your cause when we take up arms for you? Would you rather your own men and women died to make the point? And if your war is so noble, so necessary, why aren't you fighting it for yourself?" Mareel's statement is fascinating because, from the Mandalorian perspective, there's nothing more honorable than distinguishing oneself in battle. It's also worth noting that the Mandalorians evolved over the millennia to become an overwhelmingly human culture. I've already mentioned how the Essential Guide to Alien Species even describes them as a human culture. This wasn't always the case because we know they began with the Tong before incorporating the Mandalorians and many other species. There have been Zabrak, Twi'lek, Rodian, and even Weequay Mandalorians, as we see in the Knights of the Old Republic series. One extremely obscure lore note from Star Wars role-playing games suggests that an actual Hutt once claimed Mandalorian status, but this has never been confirmed and probably not something to take too seriously. The Order 66 novel includes the following explanation of diversity in Mandalorian culture. There are 2 reasons why we have to wear armor. One is so that we don't get killed too easily, the other is so that we all look Mandalorian, however different we may be from our brothers and sisters. So while the novel isn't canon, it shows that Grogu's immersion in the culture in the Mandalorian TV series is completely consistent with established lore. Nonetheless, there is an aspect of humanity's desire to conquer and dominate that makes them intrinsically drawn to Mandalorian culture. Mandalorians are intensely loyal to their clans and families, while adoptions have always been common throughout their history. We know from Star Wars Insider 86 that it was common for Mandalorians to recite the names of fallen family members and ancestors before they slept at night. Fascinatingly, they never had a word for hero in their language because they believed that being read to die for loved ones and beliefs was inherently Mandalorian. In some ways, they embody the best and worst of what it means to be human, and perhaps that's why we love them so much, despite their many obvious flaws.
Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.